The moment you stop reacting, something inside them collapses because your pain was never an accident. It was the proof they existed. What they fear most isn't that you'll leave. It's what happens when you leave and finally stop caring. If this resonates, pause for a moment and acknowledge how far you've come. And if you want deeper clarity on these dynamics, stay with me, because understanding this is part of reclaiming your power. When a narcissist hurts you, the central fear that begins to surface is the loss of control, because control is the emotional currency that regulates their sense of safety and identity. Control over your reactions, your attention, your emotions, and even your self-doubt allows them to feel powerful and intact. Hurting you is often not about anger or impulse, but about reinforcing dominance, testing how much influence they still have, and reassuring themselves that they can still shape your inner world. The moment that control weakens, their internal stability starts to fracture. If you stop reacting the way you used to, stop explaining yourself, stop pleading for understanding, or stop trying to fix the relationship, it sends a message that deeply destabilizes them. It tells them that their ability to direct your emotional state is slipping away. This is terrifying because they rely on external regulation, meaning they depend on others to manage their self-esteem and emotional balance. Without control, they feel exposed, small, and powerless, states they work relentlessly to avoid. Loss of control also confronts them with uncertainty. They no longer know what you are thinking, how you feel, or whether they still matter to you. That uncertainty triggers anxiety because they cannot tolerate not being central in someone else's psychological space. Control allows them to predict outcomes and feel superior, and when that disappears, they are left with a sense of chaos inside. They may respond by escalating behaviors such as hoovering, provoking, love bombing, or even sudden cruelty, not because they feel remorse, but because they are attempting to reestablish dominance. What they are truly reacting to is the fear that they are no longer necessary to your emotional experience. When control is lost, they are forced to confront a painful truth that contradicts their grand self-image, that they are not all-powerful, not indispensable, and not in charge of how others feel. This realization creates deep internal discomfort and shame, which they often convert into anger, blame, or manipulation directed outward, because sitting with that loss of control would mean facing their own emotional fragility. After a narcissist hurts you, your emotional detachment becomes one of the most destabilizing experiences they can face, because their sense of power is directly tied to how strongly you feel about them, whether that feeling is love, anger, sadness, or longing. Intensity matters more to them than positivity. As long as you are emotionally activated, they feel significant and in control. When you begin to emotionally disengage, stop seeking validation, and no longer respond with the same urgency or depth, it signals a loss of influence that they experience as a threat. Emotional detachment removes the feedback loop they rely on to regulate their self-worth. Without your reactions, they are left without the reassurance that they still have impact over you. This absence creates internal panic because it challenges their belief that they are central, powerful, and irreplaceable. Detachment also strips away their ability to manipulate the narrative. When you are emotionally involved, you are more likely to explain yourself, defend your feelings, or try to be understood, all of which provide openings for gaslighting and control. Once you detach, those openings close. They can no longer pull you into circular conversations or provoke emotional responses that reaffirm their dominance. This makes them feel invisible and ineffective. Your calmness and emotional distance also force them to face something deeply uncomfortable, that they no longer dictate the emotional climate of the relationship. They may interpret your detachment as rejection, abandonment, or even cruelty, because from their perspective, losing access to your emotional world feels like being erased. This perceived erasure can trigger attempts to regain control through sudden kindness, guilt, blame, or aggression. What intensifies their fear is that your detachment reflects inner change, not temporary anger. It suggests that you are no longer seeking their approval or fearing their disapproval. That shift undermines the entire dynamic they depend on. Emotional detachment communicates that you have reclaimed your autonomy, and autonomy is something a narcissist experiences as a direct challenge to their power. Without emotional leverage, they are forced to confront the reality that they cannot control how you feel, how you heal, or how you define your worth, and that realization is profoundly destabilizing. After hurting you, one of the most unsettling fears a narcissist carries is the possibility of being seen as flawed or abusive, because their psychological survival depends on maintaining an image of superiority, innocence, or justified behavior. They construct a self-concept in which they are either exceptional or misunderstood, and any suggestion that they have caused harm threatens that fragile structure. When you begin to recognize the patterns clearly and no longer excuse, minimize, or rationalize their actions, it activates deep internal shame. This is not healthy guilt that leads to accountability or repair, but a corrosive shame tied to the fear of being fundamentally defective. To the narcissist, being flawed does not feel human, it feels annihilating. If you see them as abusive, it means they are no longer in control of the narrative, and losing control of that narrative creates panic. Your clarity becomes a mirror they cannot tolerate. They fear that your perception might spread, that others might see what you see, but even more than that, they fear the private awareness that their behavior is not just misunderstood, but harmful. This awareness threatens the false self they rely on to function. When shame surfaces, it is often quickly buried under denial, rage, or projection. They may accuse you of being abusive, overly sensitive, or unstable, not because they believe it fully, but because redirecting blame allows them to escape confronting their own actions. They may rewrite history, distort facts, or present themselves as the victim, all in an effort to protect themselves from the unbearable feeling of exposure. The idea that they could be responsible for your pain challenges their sense of entitlement and moral exceptionality. If they accept that they hurt you, they would also have to accept limits, responsibility, and empathy, capacities that feel threatening rather than grounding. What they fear most is not external judgment alone, but the internal collapse that would occur if they truly acknowledged their impact. Your awareness and refusal to internalize their blame forces them closer to that edge, where their illusion of perfection weakens and the shame they work so hard to avoid begins to surface. When you begin to heal without them, it creates a profound psychological threat to a narcissist, because your recovery directly contradicts the story they tell themselves about their importance and superiority. They often believe, consciously or unconsciously, that they are the most significant person in your emotional life, the one who defines your worth, your stability, and even your future. Your pain after they hurt you reassures them of that belief because it suggests that they mattered enough to damage you. Healing disrupts that logic. When you start to regain confidence, emotional balance, and clarity without their involvement, it signals that they were not essential to your survival or happiness. This realization undermines their inflated self-image. Your growth becomes evidence that their power was never absolute. They fear this because their sense of self depends on being central, impactful, and irreplaceable. Healing also shifts the power dynamic. Instead of being the one who withholds, evaluates, or controls, they are now outside your inner world, watching you move forward without needing their approval. That loss of relevance feels like a narcissistic injury. It triggers feelings of envy, resentment, and inadequacy, emotions they are poorly equipped to process. Your healing also exposes the emptiness beneath their grandiosity. While you are building resilience and self-awareness, they remain dependent on external validation to feel okay. Seeing you develop internal strength highlights their own lack of it. This contrast can be deeply unsettling. They may respond by minimizing your progress, dismissing your growth as fake or temporary, or attempting to pull you back into old dynamics through manipulation or nostalgia. What they are trying to avoid is the painful truth that you have outgrown the version of yourself that tolerated their behavior. Your healing signals that the dynamic has ended, not because they decided it, but because you no longer need what they offered. That loss of control over your narrative and your future challenges their belief in their own dominance. Your ability to thrive independently forces them to confront the possibility that they are not as superior, powerful, or necessary as they once believed, and that realization threatens the fragile structure they rely on to maintain their sense of self. When you go silent after being hurt, it triggers a deep and specific fear in a narcissist centered on abandonment and irrelevance. Silence removes access, and access is how they confirm their importance. As long as you reach out, respond, explain, or react, they know they still occupy space in your mind. Your silence disrupts that certainty. It creates a void where reassurance used to be, and that void is intolerable to someone who relies on external attention to feel real and significant. Silence forces them to confront the possibility that they are no longer needed, no longer wanted, and no longer emotionally central. This does not register as normal separation or healthy distance to them. It feels like erasure. Without your voice, they lose the ability to monitor your emotional state, influence your perceptions, or shape the narrative. They do not know if you are angry, healed, grieving, or indifferent, and that not knowing produces anxiety and panic. Silence removes feedback, and without feedback, their sense of self destabilizes. They may begin to imagine worst-case scenarios, that you have moved on, that you no longer think about them, that someone else now occupies the role they once controlled. This perceived replacement intensifies their fear of being obsolete. Silence also denies them emotional supply. They cannot feed off your pain, confusion, or longing if you are no longer engaging. This deprivation can lead to impulsive attempts to reestablish contact through sudden apologies, provocations, or manufactured crises. These are not driven by empathy, but by the need to confirm that they still exist in your emotional world. What makes silence especially threatening is that it communicates self-containment. It suggests that you have learned to regulate your emotions without them. For a narcissist whose identity depends on being mirrored by others, this independence feels like abandonment, even if the relationship was already damaging. Silence tells them that the dynamic has ended on your terms, not theirs. It confirms that they no longer control access to you, your time, or your attention. That loss of relevance is experienced as a profound injury because without being emotionally impactful to someone else, they are forced to face an internal emptiness they spend their lives trying to avoid. Accountability is deeply frightening to a narcissist after they hurt you because it threatens the psychological defenses they rely on to protect their self-image. Being held accountable would require them to acknowledge that their actions caused harm, that they were wrong, and that they are not the exception to normal moral standards. This directly clashes with their internal narrative of superiority, entitlement, or victimhood. Unlike healthy individuals who can tolerate guilt and use it to repair and grow, narcissists experience accountability as an attack on their identity. It feels like humiliation rather than correction. When you calmly name what happened, set consequences, or refuse to accept excuses, it strips away their ability to rewrite reality. They can no longer hide behind charm, confusion, or emotional chaos. This exposure creates intense discomfort because it leaves them with nowhere to deflect responsibility. Accountability also implies limits. It suggests that there are boundaries they cannot cross without consequence, and boundaries represent a loss of power. For someone accustomed to controlling narratives and outcomes, this loss feels threatening. They fear that if they accept responsibility once, it will unravel everything, forcing them to confront a long history of harmful behavior. That level of self-reflection feels overwhelming and destabilizing. Instead of facing it, they often resort to minimizing, blaming, or attacking the person holding them accountable. This is not because they are unaware of the harm, but because acknowledging it would collapse the false self they depend on. Accountability also challenges their belief that they are entitled to forgiveness without change. When you require consistent behavior rather than apologies or emotional displays, it signals that words and manipulation are no longer enough. This exposes the emptiness of their usual tactics. They may escalate emotionally, portray themselves as the true victim, or accuse you of being unforgiving or cruel, all in an attempt to avoid responsibility. What they fear most is that accountability places the truth outside of their control. It means your reality is valid, your pain is real, and their actions have consequences that cannot be erased by denial or charm. Accepting that truth would require humility, empathy, and emotional maturity, qualities that threaten the fragile structure they use to maintain a sense of worth and dominance. When you establish and maintain boundaries after being hurt, it deeply unsettles a narcissist because boundaries interfere with their ability to manipulate, intrude, and control. They are accustomed to blurred lines where your needs are secondary and access to you is assumed. Boundaries change that structure. They introduce limits that cannot be crossed without consequence. And for a narcissist, limits feel like rejection and defiance rather than healthy self-protection. Your boundaries communicate that you are no longer available for exploitation, emotional labor, or confusion. This is threatening because manipulation relies on access and flexibility. When you say no without over-explaining, disengage from circular arguments, or refuse to respond to provocations, you remove the tools they use to destabilize you. Boundaries prevent them from rewriting reality, extracting emotional reactions, or pulling you back into familiar patterns. This loss of influence creates anxiety and frustration. They may interpret your boundaries as cruelty, abandonment, or punishment because they experience the loss of control as an injustice. Boundaries also force a shift in power. Instead of them deciding when interaction happens and on what terms, you are now in control of your time, energy, and emotional availability. This reversal challenges their sense of entitlement. They believe access to you is a right, not a privilege. When that belief is challenged, it triggers resentment and attempts to regain dominance. They may test your boundaries repeatedly, escalate behaviors, or accuse you of being selfish or cold. These reactions are designed to wear you down and restore the previous dynamic. What they fear is not the boundary itself, but what it represents. Boundaries signal self-respect, clarity, and independence. They show that you no longer need approval or fear disapproval. This undermines the power imbalance that once benefited them. Boundaries also expose their behavior. When you step back and enforce limits, the dysfunction becomes more visible both to you and potentially to others. This threatens their carefully managed image. Your consistent boundaries make it harder for them to justify their actions or portray themselves as misunderstood. They fear that if boundaries remain intact, their ability to manipulate will permanently collapse, leaving them without the control and emotional leverage they relied on to feel powerful and secure. When you reach a place of genuine indifference after being hurt, it represents the most profound loss a narcissist can experience because indifference signals the complete collapse of their influence. Anger, sadness, longing, or even resentment still confirm emotional attachment. Indifference does not. It communicates that they no longer occupy meaningful space in your inner world. For a narcissist whose sense of self depends on being emotionally impactful, this feels like psychological disappearance. They fear indifference because it cannot be manipulated. There is no emotion to provoke, no wound to reopen, no reaction to exploit. Your neutrality removes their ability to feel powerful through your responses. Indifference also strips away the illusion of specialness. It places them on the same emotional level as strangers or passing acquaintances. This equality is intolerable to someone who believes they must be exceptional, admired, or feared to exist comfortably. When you no longer care whether they approve, disapprove, stay, or leave, it destabilizes their identity. They may attempt to reignite emotion through provocation, charm, or dramatic gestures, not because they want connection, but because they want confirmation that they still matter. Indifference denies them that confirmation. It also confirms something they dread, that you have integrated the experience and moved on psychologically. This suggests finality. There is no unresolved bond, no lingering hope, no emotional hook left to pull. That finality removes their sense of control over the narrative. They are no longer the central figure in your story. Your indifference also highlights an uncomfortable contrast. While you are able to disengage and self-regulate, they remain dependent on others for emotional validation. This dependency becomes more visible to them in the absence of your attention. They may experience emptiness, restlessness, or rage, but these feelings cannot be resolved through you anymore. What indifference ultimately communicates is freedom. It shows that you are no longer defined by what they did, how they treated you, or how they see you. That freedom is terrifying to a narcissist because it confirms that their influence has ended, their power has expired, and their presence in your emotional life is no longer required.